My neighbor always said the lights on his property were his business, but the night my bedroom looked brighter than a football field at halftime, I realized some people don't just want to live next to you. They want to dominate you. He smiled when I asked him why every floodlight pointed straight into my windows and said, "Maybe you should buy better curtains." Looking back now, that sentence probably cost him more than if he had simply admitted he was trying to make my life miserable. My name is Ethan Carter, and for 21 years I lived in the same little neighborhood outside Franklin, Tennessee, where people borrowed ladders from each other, waved while mowing their lawns, and argued mostly about whose dog dug holes in whose flower beds. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like home. My wife and I raised our son there, celebrated birthdays on the back deck, watched thunderstorms roll across the hills, and planted a maple tree the day we paid off our mortgage. That tree eventually grew tall enough to shade half the yard, and I always joked that it had become the oldest member of the family. Then about a year and a half before all this happened, the house next door sold to a man named Victor Hale. He arrived with 2 moving trucks, a brand new pickup, and an attitude that somehow reached the neighborhood before his furniture did. At first, everyone gave him the benefit of the doubt. New places are stressful, people need time to settle in, and maybe he just wasn't much of a people person. But little things started happening almost immediately. When my sister visited for Thanksgiving, Victor parked his truck halfway across the curb in front of my property so nobody else could fit there. When I politely asked if he could move it, he looked over his sunglasses and said, "Public street, isn't it?" before walking back inside. A month later, his sprinkler system somehow managed to spray everything except his own lawn. My driveway flooded every morning, leaving muddy streaks all over my garage floor. Then there was the afternoon my son came over with his acoustic guitar to practice on the patio while we grilled burgers. It was 3 in the afternoon on a Saturday. Birds were louder than the music, yet somehow the sheriff's deputy knocked on my door because of a noise complaint. The deputy looked embarrassed. He glanced at my son, who was softly playing an old country song, and quietly said, "Honestly, I have to respond when someone calls." He apologized before leaving, but I already knew exactly who had made that phone call. My wife, Claire, had a saying that saved me from making stupid decisions. She would squeeze my arm and whisper, "Don't wrestle with pigs. You both get dirty, and one of you enjoys it." So every time Victor poked at us, I let it go. I told myself he would eventually get bored. I thought ignoring him would starve the problem. Instead, it seemed to feed it. One Saturday morning, I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when I heard drilling outside. Not normal home improvement drilling either, but the kind that echoes through your windows and makes your coffee ripple in the mug. I stepped onto the porch and saw 2 contractors unloading massive industrial floodlights from the back of a trailer. They were attaching heavy steel brackets to Victor's fence posts, each one taller than my shoulder. I walked closer and asked one of the workers what they were installing. Before he could answer, Victor came out carrying a clipboard like he was supervising a stadium renovation. "Outdoor security lighting," he said with a grin that somehow felt rehearsed. I looked at the angle of the first fixture and then at my own bedroom window. It wasn't aimed toward his driveway. It wasn't pointed at his garage or his backyard gate. It was pointed directly into my house. "You know that's facing my property, right?" I asked. He shrugged. "Light goes where light goes." I waited for him to laugh, to admit it was temporary or accidental. But instead he folded his arms and added, "Everything I'm doing is legal." Then he turned around and disappeared into his house, while the workers continued bolting the remaining fixtures into place. By sunset, there were 4 enormous floodlights standing along his fence like watchtowers, silent for the moment, but somehow threatening anyway. Claire stood beside me at the kitchen window and whispered, "Tell me those aren't going to stay like that." I wanted to tell her everything would be fine, but for the first time since moving into that neighborhood over 2 decades earlier, I wasn't sure that it would. The first night those lights came on, I understood exactly what Victor had intended all along. It wasn't security, it wasn't decoration, and it certainly wasn't an accident. At precisely 7:46 that evening, just as the last bit of orange disappeared behind the trees, all 4 floodlights exploded to life at the same time, washing my bedroom walls in a harsh white glow so bright that for a second I honestly thought a utility truck had pulled into the yard. Claire looked up from her book and squinted. "Are you kidding me?" she said, standing to close the curtains, but the curtains barely mattered. The light poured around the edges, reflected off the dresser mirror, bounced across the hallway, and even reached the family room. Our dog Cooper wandered around confused, staring at the windows like morning had somehow arrived 3 hours early. I walked outside and looked back toward my own house, and the sight almost made me laugh from disbelief. My place looked like a movie set under giant production lights. Meanwhile, Victor sat comfortably on his back patio with a glass of iced tea, pretending to scroll through his phone while occasionally glancing in my direction. He wanted me to react. He wanted an argument. Instead, I simply turned around and went back inside. Claire followed me into the kitchen and asked, "What are you going to do?" I poured another cup of coffee, even though it was almost 8 at night, and said, "The same thing I've always done. I'll let the rules do the talking before I do." The next morning, I contacted County Code Enforcement. I didn't call to complain emotionally. I wrote everything down carefully: the direction of the lights, the estimated height of the fixtures, the times they operated, and how they directly entered occupied rooms of my home. Years of working as a project manager had taught me something important. Feelings disappear in meetings, documentation doesn't. 2 days later, an inspector named Linda arrived carrying a clipboard, a measuring device, and the kind of patient expression people develop after spending years settling neighborhood disputes. She listened without interrupting while I explained the situation, then stood in my yard taking measurements from multiple locations. After sunset, she returned to observe the lights in operation. She shook her head almost immediately. "These are significantly exceeding the allowable spillover for residential property," she said, "and they're directly aimed into occupied windows." She crossed over to Victor's yard and knocked on his door. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see his animated hand gestures from across the fence. He pointed toward my house several times while Linda calmly continued writing on her clipboard. 20 minutes later, she returned and handed me a copy of the report. "He's receiving a correction notice," she explained. "He has 30 days to remedy the violation." I thanked her, believing common sense had finally entered the picture. Claire smiled for the first time in days. "See," she said, "people can't just do whatever they want." I wish that had been the end of the story. It wasn't. About a week later, my phone buzzed while I was trimming hedges. It was a text from an unknown number. "Hope you're enjoying your government, friends. Maybe spend less money on complaints and more on decent curtains." There was no signature, but none was necessary. I stared at the message for a moment before deleting it. Then I walked around the side of my house and immediately noticed something new. There weren't 4 lights anymore. There were 6. 2 additional fixtures had been mounted even higher than the originals, both angled with almost mathematical precision toward the upstairs bedroom where Claire and I slept. I actually laughed out loud because the sheer stubbornness of it seemed absurd. Claire came outside and asked why I was laughing. I showed her the new lights, and she covered her face with both hands. "He's trying to punish us," she whispered. "No," I answered after a long pause. "He's trying to prove he can't be told what to do." That distinction mattered. People acting out of anger sometimes calm down. People acting out of pride often double down. The following weekend, our next-door neighbors on the opposite side, Mike and Susan, invited us over for coffee. They had noticed everything but hadn't wanted to get involved. Susan quietly admitted that Victor had complained to them several times about us, claiming we were trying to control the neighborhood. Mike rolled his eyes and said, "You've lived here longer than anyone on this block." Nobody believes him. Then he leaned closer and added, "Just don't let him drag you into becoming like him." Those words stayed with me during the drive home. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. But peace requires 2 willing participants, and Victor seemed interested only in winning a competition nobody else knew existed. That Monday, I stopped at a hardware supply store to replace a broken shelf bracket in my garage. While walking through the building materials aisle, I passed a display of large mirror panels designed for workshops and home gyms. I paused without really knowing why. The polished surfaces reflected rows of fluorescent lights back toward the ceiling, multiplying brightness without creating any light of their own. An employee walked over and asked if I needed help. I smiled and said, "Maybe. Tell me, are these safe for outdoor use if they're properly mounted?" He explained that with the right backing and weather protection, they could be installed in covered exterior applications. I thanked him, loaded 4 large panels onto a cart, then added heavy-duty brackets, treated lumber, stainless screws, and adjustable mounting hardware. On the drive home, I wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. I was thinking about geometry. Every action follows a path. Every beam of light has an angle. Physics doesn't care who started the argument. It simply follows the rules. When I unloaded everything into the garage, Claire walked in carrying grocery bags. She stared at the mirrors and then at me. Please tell me you're not building some kind of art project. I couldn't help smiling. No, I replied. I'm building a lesson. She crossed her arms and laughed despite herself. Should I be worried? Only if Isaac Newton was wrong. For the next 2 evenings after work, I measured distances from the fence, checked angles with a laser level, adjusted brackets by fractions of an inch, and tightened bolts until each panel sat perfectly aligned. From the street, they looked surprisingly ordinary, almost decorative, reflecting trees and clouds during the day. Victor noticed them while collecting his mail and shouted across the yard. Trying to make your place look bigger? I looked up from my toolbox and answered, just making some improvements. He chuckled confidently and walked away, completely uninterested. That was the moment I knew he hadn't figured it out. He thought conflict was about louder words, bigger gestures, and intimidation. He never considered that the most effective response might require no argument at all. By Friday evening, the final adjustments were complete. I stood beside Claire as the sun slowly disappeared behind the neighborhood rooftops. We didn't speak much. We simply watched the shadows grow longer until the automatic timer on Victor's security system clicked exactly as it had every night before. A fraction of a second later, the 6 floodlights ignited across the fence, sending thousands of brilliant white beams racing toward our property. And this time, they found something waiting for them. For about half a second, nothing seemed different. Then the entire backyard changed. Instead of disappearing into my bedroom windows, those 6 powerful beams struck the mirror panels one after another and turned around like soldiers receiving a new set of orders. The light didn't become stronger. It simply went back where it came from, pouring across Victor's patio, splashing against the side of his house, and flooding his own bedroom windows with the same relentless brightness he had forced into ours every single night. Claire looked at me, then back across the fence, and finally burst into laughter so hard she had to grab my arm to steady herself. Even Cooper, our old dog, tilted his head toward the neighboring yard as if he knew something unusual had happened. Across the fence, I heard a chair scrape against concrete, followed by a surprised voice. Victor stepped onto his patio, shielding his eyes with one hand. He stared at the mirrors, then at the lights, then back at the mirrors again, trying to understand why his carefully planned weapon had suddenly changed sides. He marched over to the fence and shouted, "What the hell is this supposed to be?" I walked over calmly, keeping my voice low. "Outdoor improvements," I answered. "Perfectly legal, as far as I know." For the first time since he had moved into the neighborhood, he had absolutely nothing to say. He stood there for several seconds, opened his mouth twice, then turned around and disappeared into his house. About 15 minutes later, the lights switched off. Claire smiled and whispered, "Maybe he finally got the message." I shook my head. "No, he's trying to figure out another move." She knew I was probably right. The following evening, the lights came back on, but only for about 5 minutes before they shut off again. The reflections made his own upstairs rooms glow like television studios. On the 3rd night, he experimented by adjusting the angles. Unfortunately for him, I had spent hours calculating the placement of the mirrors, and his adjustments only redirected the glare toward different parts of his own property. The next morning, I was watering flowers when Mike from down the street walked over carrying his coffee mug. He looked toward the fence and grinned. "So, physics 1. I laughed. "I guess you could say that." He nodded slowly and said, "You know, around here everyone has been talking. Nobody thinks you're doing anything wrong. You're not creating light. You're just returning what you were given." That sentence stayed with me because it described the situation better than anything else. I wasn't attacking him. I wasn't installing sirens or speakers or anything destructive. I was simply refusing to be the final destination for someone else's bad intentions. By Monday afternoon, a contractor's truck pulled into Victor's driveway. 2 workers climbed ladders and began removing fixtures one by one. The process took almost 3 hours. Every bolt that had gone into those fence posts came back out. Every heavy light was lowered into the truck bed, and by sunset the entire row had vanished. My bedroom was dark again for the first time in weeks. That night, Claire and I sat on the back deck listening to crickets, something we had almost forgotten we could do. There was no harsh white glow, no frustration, no feeling that someone next door was trying to invade our peace. just quiet. I thought the story was over until Thursday evening when the Homeowners Association held its monthly meeting. I almost skipped it, but Mike insisted I should come. The meeting covered landscaping budgets, mailbox repairs, and holiday decorations before the board president cleared her throat and announced she had received a written statement from a resident requesting that it be entered into the community record. She unfolded a sheet of paper and began reading. The letter admitted that recent actions involving exterior lighting had created unnecessary conflict, acknowledged that neighboring homeowners deserved reasonable enjoyment of their property, and apologized for escalating the situation instead of resolving it through respectful conversation. She never looked in my direction while reading, but everyone in the room knew exactly who had written it and exactly why it existed. When she finished, the room stayed silent for a moment before moving on to the next agenda item, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. On the way out, several neighbors patted me on the shoulder. One older gentleman smiled and said, "Sometimes people only understand when they have to stand where you've been standing." I drove home thinking about that sentence. I never hated Victor. In fact, I almost felt sorry for him. Winning seemed so important to him that he forgot what living next to other people is supposed to mean. A neighborhood isn't a battlefield where every fence line is a front line. It's a place where respect saves everyone time, money, and pride. Months later, we rarely spoke beyond a polite nod when collecting the mail. The mirrors eventually came down because they were no longer needed, but every now and then I catch the afternoon sun reflecting off one of my windows onto his garage door, and it reminds me that life has a funny way of sending things back to where they started. Some people call what I did petty. Others call it justice. I honestly don't know which one is right anymore. I only know that asking nicely didn't work. Arguing wouldn't have worked either. And sometimes the most powerful response is simply letting someone experience the exact consequences of their own choices. So now I want to ask you, if you had been in my position, would you have done the same thing, or would you have handled it differently? Was reflecting those lights back an act of fairness, or just another form of revenge? Share your opinion in the comments, because stories like this never have only one side, and I'm willing to bet this neighborhood debate isn't over yet.